This is the DarshanTalks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. We have a very special guest. We have Kelly Willenberg, and you guys listened to her probably about a month ago, and she was talking about networking, and we were talking about how COVID has affected networking and conferences, and turns out you guys really enjoyed having her on. So I asked Kelly, and she was kind enough to come back again, and we have her talking to us again today, and we're going to talk about coverage analyses. And to some of you guys, that sounds like it's really scary. You're in clinical trials, you've got to figure out coverage analysis, and the question is, who does it? What does it mean? Do I even need it? And we're going to talk to Kelly to figure out what all of this means and then see how things have changed. So Kelly, welcome. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself again, Kelly?
Good morning, everyone. Darshan, thanks for having me. I own a consulting company that does healthcare research compliance. I am a nurse by background, oncology mostly, as I was a bedside nurse and a clinical trial nurse. And since I left the bedside nursing area, I have gotten a doctorate in business, and I have owned my consulting company for almost 12 years. Wow.
I am fascinated, and I've known you for a lot of those 12 years, Kelly, and you've always been the go-to coverage analysis, the go-to expert on issues related to clinical trials. So tell me a little bit about what you do in the consulting company now.
Well, I have a team of people that work with me as independent contractors all across the country, and we provide specific consulting on everything from clinical trials management, IRB, revenue cycle, coverage analysis, budgeting, contracting, the whole process flow of billing compliance from the intake of a study through implementation of opening the trial and putting a patient on study. And we are involved at various levels at hospitals across the country, from academic medical centers to community-based hospitals to research facilities and offices to a physician practice that just does a couple studies a year.
So have you found that there is a right size for people who are engaging you?
Well, that's a great question. That's an interesting question because, when you work in consulting, you start to think about the things that, is your sweet spot, and where do you find that you are able to make dramatic changes and offer assistance quickly. And what we find is, the smaller the entity, the quicker we can get in and do an assessment, help them implement, do a gap analysis, implement change, and have a contingency plan for how they want to move forward, especially if they're a growing, smaller site. What we find with a larger site is it does take us more time, more energy, more hours to a lot of times get through the necessary tape and silos that seem to be part of a functioning larger hospital system or academic medical center.
So let's address each of those separately. When you're dealing with a smaller site and they come to you and they say, Kelly, we don't actually know what we're doing around coverage analyses. You're coming in obviously as an expert. You're not looking at just the coverage analysis at that point. You're looking at what sort of issues people face and that caused this issue in the first place. So talk me through a typical client. When they walk through, what is it that you walk through the door asking for your help? How do you sort of probe? What are you looking for? And what are they often making mistakes with?
Well, first and foremost, what we try to do is help them assess what they really want us to do, and scope out the work that needs to be done, given their wants and needs, and given usually it's pain points. It's, why are they coming to us? Well, we have decided that our coverage analysis process isn't really what we want it to be, or we don't really have a coverage analysis process. Or we have done coverage analysis processes through the last few years, either through, vendors or, employees. Now we're trying to figure out how do we take this and, really operationalize it throughout our industry of what all of our hospitals are, all of our clinics are. And a lot of times it's because it's being promoted by a change, such as they've done a merger, or there's been an acquisition, or they've purchased physician groups. And many times we find that there's a disruption of some sort, and they're at a point where they have to look at, is this process working and how are we doing it? Because if they're not doing a coverage analysis at the onset and using that coverage analysis to do their budget, contract, and consent, they can have problems. And many times what happens is, and it's what we talked about last time, people would hear me speak at a conference, they would come up to me and say, well, can we have a conversation, because we're not doing it in the order that you just brought up that we should be doing it.
So that's interesting to me. I'm going to ask a really basic question before we continue, because I know that the first time I heard it from you, I was surprised. And then as I've spoken to clients over time, they were surprised as well. So my first question to you is, what I'd like you to explain is, what is coverage analyses? And the second part of it is, you might address this as you're speaking, which is, when I talk to clients and I go, so have you done a coverage analysis? When I'm writing your contract, do you want me to start thinking about reimbursement from payers? I inevitably get the pushback going, no, we're only looking at reimbursement from pharma. We're going to expect to be privately paid for all of it. So what is your take on both of those? Do you get that pushback?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, there are sites, and we have numerous clients that struggle to do a coverage analysis and then actually bill a patient for the items and services as part of a trial that are considered to be routine costs. So, they're questioning whether they should go ahead and try to have the sponsor pay for everything versus you are going to bill the patient for certain items and services within a trial. That's a question, and that's a business decision. And a lot of times it's set business rules that sites make. But to your first point, a coverage analysis is an analysis of all the documents, and I mean the documents that go with a study, a final protocol, an investigational drug brochure, a draft contract, a draft budget. What does the sponsor intend to cover, and what does the protocol actually say? And then a coverage analysis takes all of those documents and assesses and analyzes whether or not every line item that's on the study calendar is, first of all, correct, and everything is listed that should be listed, and likely there are things that need to be added, as there are going to be charges flowing through a system that sometimes isn't allocated on a calendar as well as it should be. And I'll give you an example. And one of the best examples that we use is a biopsy of a certain area. If you're going to do a biopsy, there's not just a biopsy code that's the magical code for payment from a payer that you should be reimbursed for if a sponsor's covering it. There are numerous codes that go with a biopsy. And what we find many times is when we look at a study calendar, that biopsy is not busted out to all the codes it should be for reimbursement, because if you are going to have the sponsor pay for it, you want them to pay for all of those codes that go with the various biopsy costs and not just one code, because then you're not truly covering your cost.
Interesting. So what you often land up doing is really finding ways for these clients to get paid that they hadn't even considered that.
Absolutely. There are clients that they do not bill for any item or service on a study calendar for any of their trials. And you're talking that not all trials are sponsored by a pharmaceutical company or a device company. There are trials that are investigator initiated, that there's no funding. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's a partner funder who might only be providing a drug, as an example. And then you have, of course, the National Cancer Institute cooperative studies that there are sometimes funding mechanisms for various items and services, but the NCI, the National Cancer Institute, and all of the research bases, the cooperative bases that are out there, they don't pay for every line item in a study calendar, which is why when we go in, we ask the client, why would you be billing your cooperative group patients for all of their items and services when over here you're saying that you'd rather have the sponsor pay for everything? Isn't that a little bit of a disconnect? And ethically, then are you really actually offering the patient the right choice to make a decision in an informed consent if they actually are eligible for more than one study? Would a patient pick a study that they're going to be billed for versus a study that the sponsor is going to pay for everything? And if that's the choice, are you persuading the patient or enticing the patient to participate? There's a lot of ethical questions with whether or not you should be billing a patient for items and services that are considered to be routinely done in a clinical trial. And that is what a coverage analysis helps to designate and outline throughout the process for the patient, so the patient knows what they will be financially responsible for.
So one of the things I land up doing now in a lot of the work I do is advising clients, often sponsors, but often sites and the like as well, is talking about this whole concept around patient centricity. And what you're really talking about is the behavior of these sites really patient centric? Are patients going to go, I have better options, or you as a site didn't look out for my best interest? So do you find yourself confronting these issues of patient centricity, or have they not come across your table yet?
I think my answer to that would be, we sometimes are working with a client and we might see that from the periphery. We might be involved in helping them to make business rules and business decisions around how they build their coverage analysis. Are they going to bill for the routine cost in a qualifying trial? If they are, how does that process work? If they decide that they want to accept, if a sponsor says they're going to pay for something, then how do they ensure that they stop that claim and that they make sure that no claim goes out? A lot of times the problem with some of the clients, and this has been ever since the clinical trial policy came out 20 years ago in this coming October. That's been one of the biggest questions for the industry, is pharmaceutical sponsors, especially in oncology, and now it's even, I would say it's spread out to other diseases, is they know that the clinical trial policy exists, and they don't want to pay for everything in a trial if they don't have to. And that Medicare opened the door when they expanded the benefits, in the clinical trial policy, which is why we do coverage analysis today. So I think, when you talk about patient centricity and do we really take the patient at heart? I think, again, it boils down to, making sure the patient has adequate informed consent and adequate knowledge about what they are going to be involved in, whether it's sponsors going to pay for items and services, whether their insurance is going to be billed, and whether or not they might have to pay out of pocket. Right. And if they're coming in for a regular cancer care visit, they're going to be paying out of pocket for some of their care, or would have been, minus the trial regardless.
Interesting. So we've been talking so far about smaller sites. How do you deal with larger sites that are coming to you?
Well, I would say that it's a challenge in some ways, because many times we are dealing with a lot of different divisions, areas, silos within the larger sites. What you really have to realize is that, this clinical trial billing process that we're talking about, it takes an enormous amount of energy, an enormous amount of communication and collaboration at any site, regardless of the size, to get this right. And what we find in the larger sites that are somewhat decentralized, there's more of a slowdown in the process and trying to get the technology, together and with an interface, so that the clinical trial patient is not adversely impacted by the fact that it's hard for the larger site to communicate about billing compliance, which is why most of the larger facilities that we deal with have, electronic systems in place. They have automation in their EMR, such as Epic or Cerner. They have a CTMS. I mean, they have the technology footprint that makes them to be able to better react to the patient's needs from a claims perspective. And a lot of the smaller sites that we deal with, they don't have that. They don't do that many trials, and the expense is not, a value to them, more to set up a process to do it by, actually by paper or by hand, to make sure that they don't submit a claim improperly. And really, ultimately, that's the whole goal of a coverage analysis billing compliance process, is to not submit an incorrect claim to a government payer. And I'm not saying you should submit an incorrect claim to commercial payers, but the False Claims Act and the rules around the clinical trial policy directly impacts government payers at a higher level. And that's why places do this process, build a process, have people who do it, and follow it with a compliance eye, because it is huge if you are caught or you are involved in a whistleblower suit and you pay penalties and fines and triple damages on claims that were submitted incorrectly in a clinical trial world for a patient.
Well, I think what we need to do is have another podcast talking about some of these issues as well, when we're talking about sort of managing a much larger site. I think we've run out of time here a little bit, but Kelly, would you be willing to come on again and talk about this a little bit more?
Oh, absolutely. Always.
One last question. How do people find you?
Well, I have a website. It's kellywillenberg.com, or you can email me at kelly@kellywillenberg.com. I am active on LinkedIn and Twitter, and have a group on LinkedIn on clinical trial billing compliance. And if you link up with me on LinkedIn, we will get you involved in that group as well.
Perfect. Kelly, thank you again for being on. I am looking forward to our next time soon.
I am as well, Darshan. Thank you for having me.
This is the DarshanTalks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks, or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.